Hi, everyone. I'm Andy Carvin, Managing Editor and Senior Fellow at the Digital Forensic Research Lab. And I'd like to welcome you to this event discussing our new report, Undermining Ukraine, How Russia Widened Its Global Information War in 2023. In this report, DFRLab researchers across more than a dozen countries investigated how Russia entrenched its information operations around the world over the last year, with the singular goal of undermining Ukraine, including demoralizing its people, damaging global public confidence in Ukraine's ability to fight, and eroding Western support for the war effort. Now, these operations came in many forms, from massive smear campaigns on TikTok, coordinated public diplomacy messaging on Twitter, to RT and Sputnik propagating narratives tailored to local audiences all over the world. In other words, it was a global strategy of information warfare with parallel theaters of operations working in concert with each other. So, in today's conversation, we're going to hear from our team of researchers looking at Russia's efforts targeting Ukraine, domestic Russian audiences, Europe and the South Caucasus, North Africa and the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Latin America. Truly a global research effort. We'll then be joined by Olga Tokaryuk, who is the Open Society University Network Academy Fellow at Chatham House's Ukraine Forum. And she's going to moderate a conversation among the research team. Now, I'm sure a lot of you will have questions at various points. So at any time, if you'd like to present a question to our researchers or to Olga as moderator, you can share them with us at askac.org. Again, that's askac.org. Just write up your question there and we'll then see it. So with that, I'd like to invite DFRLab Research Associate Roman Osadchuk to kick off today's conversation. Roman.
Thank you, Andy. Hi all. So today we'll present you a short slide deck. So can we get it on the screen? Yeah, thank you very much. So let's just jump straight into this. So first of all, we will discuss the campaigns in Ukraine. So the Russia's attempts and campaigns and actions in Ukraine. So the tactics in 2023 were somewhat similar to the tactics in 2024, but 2022, sorry, but they had a bigger scale. There is different and wider campaigns. On top of that, they are more nuanced and targeted. So there are more campaigns that are using advertisements by targeting specific population, and also they became more diverse. Also, they focus on damaging the social cohesion inside Ukraine so that Ukraine will stop resisting Russia's operation and actually give up. So this is one of the main objectives there. And one of the biggest thing as well, it was the amplification of internal problems and issues that Ukraine faced during this hard time. So Russians are trying to double down on that, trying to make the issues within Ukraine bigger and worse than they actually are. So about the operations that discredited the Ukrainian leadership. So as Andy already mentioned, one of the biggest campaigns that went covered this year was a TikTok campaign aimed at Ukrainian leadership, discrediting it and blaming it in corruption by spreading disinformation that those people bought some luxurious items, when in reality it was all not true, simply because anybody could have checked the veracity of these claims, and this kind of property is still on sale, so it wasn't true. Another thing is the ads, as I already said. So here's one of the ads that you could see that tried to amplify the clash between different people, between military and political leadership, and trying to wedge the divides between Ukrainian leadership so that Ukraine would be divided and thus less able to fight against and resist Russians. Another thing is that we found out that there is a continuation of the weapon trade disinformation, namely a narrative that Ukraine supposedly sells Western donated and aided weaponry, when in reality it is not true. Was debunked, but this thing is actually started in April 2022 and it's still ongoing. Another thing is the pessimistic content, right? So I showed you a part of the ad that was spread to amplify some divides between Ukrainian leadership, but the same negative news and negative opinions, let's say short articles, were spread aimed at general population, trying to demonstrate that there is no positive in the Ukrainian future, so you should give up, and etc. And finally, it's the large-scale campaign with forged websites that also publish negative content as a part of doppelganger campaign, which is also started and was first uncovered in last year, or actually in 2022, and continued spreading in 2023, and it's still ongoing because we even now see the continuation of it. So it was extremely wide, efficient, and targeted not only on Ukrainians and at Ukrainians, but also at European audiences as well. And now we're switching towards Russia. So what Russia actually done within itself, right? Within its own territory. So the first thing worth mentioning is the Prigozhin mutiny and the erasure of Wagner. Erasure means from the public space, from information space. So that actually before the mutiny, it was a popular topic. Well-known Russian propagandists amplified Wagner, but after this mutiny, they became silent, and it actually disappeared from public space. I mentioned here the death of Navalny. It was not covered in the report because we focused on 2023, but it was worth mentioning that actually all the issues that are being connected with this, that the Russian government does, is actually somewhat echo what Russia does to opposing forces within the country. The next thing is increased surveillance, so that actually there are a few systems that monitor content and try to find users that are spreading anti-governmental content. The blocking and undermining of VPN services within Russia, also another thing that we mentioned, was quite efficient and widespread this year. Specifically, OpenVPN protocol was targeted by Russian authorities. And finally, ways for digitalized mobilization and harsher punishment for people to avoiding being drafted. It was another particular point in this year's efforts within Russia to actually consolidate forces and put the country in more warlike effort. And on this, I pass the floor to my wonderful colleague, Sopo. Sopo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Roman. Hi, everyone. I don't see this slide deck. Yeah, thank you. So like in 2023, we also observed that Russian messages were proliferated on X platform, formerly known as Twitter. And basically it served as major platform for proliferation and targeting the Western audiences after many Western countries banned Russia Today and Sputnik in 2022. And we also saw, like, we can explain this factor and the shift in the proliferation by several factors. One is that we saw that the trust and safety team staff was massively reduced. The second factor was that Twitter no longer labels state-sponsored media outlets such as RT and Sputnik. This means that the messages had more outreach. And the third one was that revision in blue check marks policy. So now everyone can verify themselves, and this means that for a monthly fee, we can get some suspicious accounts verified. And this is what you see on the screen. These are like two examples when verified accounts spread pro-Kremlin disinformation about Ukraine and Estonia, and we have many other cases discussed in the report, and you can read the cases, and some of these case studies also reached millions of users on the platform. Next slide, Roman, please. To continue with the overall review and observation of the region, many things happened in 2023, and we saw that Russia attempted to tailor its narratives to the specific local context and audiences and local grievances and developments. Two common threats that we observed in South Caucasus, Moldova, and Europe, and of course, this is a huge region, and we have all these details in the report. This was energy blackmail, and at some point, as part of this energy blackmail, South Caucasus countries increased trade with Russia, particularly in terms of oil and natural gas transports, imports, and also promotion of warmongering narratives. Next slide, please. Roman already mentioned this doppelganger operation, and one of the messages they promoted was that Russian gas and energy was vital for EU economy. This was in an online domain, but in an offline domain, we saw that Gazprom actually reduced supplies in Moldova and framed the pro-European government and Ukraine as responsible for the hardships that followed the reduction of the supplies. Next slide, please. In terms of warmongering narratives, of course, this took various forms, but it tied back to fostering the domestic fears of war, and it used scare tactics. In Poland, for example, and Ukraine, Russia spread disinformation that Poland had hostile attitudes towards Ukraine and wanted to occupy Ukrainian territories. In Moldova, Russia spread disinfo that Moldova, Ukraine, and sometimes we saw NATO as part of this narrative to attempted to intervene Moldova's breakaway region of Transnistria. And in Georgia, it's interesting that it took form of peace weaponization from the Georgian Dream-led government, implying that vocal support towards Ukraine would mean West's attempt to drag Georgia into war. And it also had another dimension to advance its political agenda, not only related to Ukraine. Next slide, please. To continue this warmongering thing, we also saw the narratives proliferating in Georgia and Armenia, that Ukraine's path meant war, and it was leading to a war. And as part of this narrative, we also saw the messages amplified by Georgian government accusing USAID of plotting revolution and destabilization. And interestingly, this narrative was also amplified by state-controlled media outlets in Azerbaijan. And last point is the trade with Russia. This is common thread also what we observed in the South Caucasus. We know that around the Karabakh situation, Armenia's relations with Russia strained, but the country still increased its trade with Russia. In Georgia, we also saw increased imports of natural gas and oil in 2022 after Russia invaded Ukraine. And by 2023, we also saw that Russia was Azerbaijan's third biggest trade partner. So to summarize this very broad region, what we saw in terms of commonalities was the energy blackmail targeting different countries in the region, and also using of scare tactics and amplification of warmongering narratives. I'll stop here and pass it over to Val, who will cover Russian infobs in Africa.
Hi, everyone. Very pleased to be presenting today our work on Africa for this large event of our report. So I'll make it very brief and start with our takeaways for the African region. Just a few elements, because Russia has doubled down on its historic ties with African nations and has established various types of partnerships, which expanded in 2023, and also with newly incorporated BRICS countries. Russia has also positioned itself as a global force against colonialism, which was already a narrative that we saw in 2022 and was expanding in 2023. And we can say that Russia has also adopted this posture during diplomatic events in which it invited African countries during the Russia-Africa Summit in 2023. The African landscape is unfortunately still very much prone and susceptible to disseminating Russian narratives that distort the view of the war, and that is mostly due to certain political hardships that Russia is portraying in a way that is favorable to its political agenda and defaming what is actually happening in Ukraine, and also to its partnership with African media and also Pan-Africanist media, specifically in Western Africa, which we look more into in depth, during in the report that you can read. The next slide, please. So Russia has continued its efforts to develop its diplomatic ties with African countries, despite one major setback, which was the death of the co-founder of the Wagner Group, Yevgeny Prigozhin. But in diplomatic and on the strategic scene, we can say that Russia has really benefited from the year 2023 because of the Russia-Africa summit that took place in St. Petersburg. The former summit took place in 2018 in Sochi. And well, as you can see on the picture, you have Vladimir Putin sitting next to the transition president of Burkina Faso and the president of Cameroon. So all 54 states were almost all represented in this event, and it served as a platform for Russia to expand on the narrative that it was a humanitarian state that was also providing security to the region. It also helped broker economic deals. And on that note, I think that the security and the military aspect is also very important when we talk about Russia's involvement in Africa. So I've also included a picture of the Army 2023 Forum, which took place in Moscow last year, and you can see that there was a delegation of Burkina Faso, but also took part in this forum. Now, one of the other setbacks, I guess, for Vladimir Putin is that ahead of the BRICS summit in Johannesburg, there was a controversy surrounding his attendance due to the ICC warrant for his arrest, and he eventually opted out and instead presented his talking points with a video link and sent Lavrov instead. The next slide, please. Now talking about the Russian media partnerships, we can say that Russia has definitely expanded its media presence in Africa, from in partnerships with BRICS-based outlets and disseminating content to more audience than ever. African media often echoed narratives first published by Russian news outlets, particularly around issues like the grain crisis. We can see that Sputnik Africa, for instance, spread narratives that blame the West for grain shortages in Africa. I'll talk about that more in a bit. But what is interesting is that Russia is making some of the tactics that it used currently before more official. What we've seen is that TV hosts from Russia today can now be broadcast on Pan-Africanist TV shows throughout Western Africa. Russia has also expanded its media presence to BRICS outlets, as I said before. Those are initiatives that we suspect are linked to info loss to an agency that was flagged for collaboration with the GRU. So that also gives, I guess, a very good outlook of how Russia is trying to manipulate the information sphere. The next slide, please. So the grain crisis is actually a very good example of how Russia has been able to sway media pressure and to change the narrative around what was happening in the war in Ukraine. What we see is that several narratives that were tailored by Sputnik Africa have been reposted to news outlets throughout Cameroon and also to Lebanon that say that the West was not providing its fair share of free grain to African countries that were dependent on Ukrainian grain, whereas Russia was very much responsible for the creation of the grain crisis in the first place by bombing Ukrainian harbors and by blockading Ukrainian cargo ships out of the Black Sea. And the next slide, please. There's also evidence that suggests that not only media outlets, but also individuals participate in repackaging and distributing Russian propaganda. This is an excerpt from a case study of the report, but is also in a longer form piece that is written by my colleague Tessa Knight. And we took a look at this network, which originates from Cote d'Ivoire and exemplifies how local actors disseminated pro-Kremlin narratives on platforms like Facebook and Telegram, even after being deplatformed by Meta. And what is very interesting is that the dynamic is that an individual repurposed this group to the group was been renamed, to the Operation of Denazification of Ukraine. So it repurposed Russian narratives about the war in Ukraine and then reposted content from pro-Russian news outlets in French or translated from Russian into French. And with that, I'll pass it on to my colleague Dina.
Thank you, Val. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you are. Thank you for joining us. Pleasure to be here. For the Middle East and North Africa region, we focus some of our research on how Russia's messaging is reaching Arabic speakers and how aligns, or rather doesn't, with the views of audiences of the region and those of their governments. Our main takeaways from that was that as several countries in the region go through democratic backsliding, especially years after the Arabic Spring revolutions, the MENA region have become more of a fertile ground for Russian disinformation and propaganda narratives, and with some susceptibilities to disinformation narratives related to topics related to human rights in particular. So people in the region now are facing the realities of deterioration political conditions in their countries and return to authoritarian rule, where their leaders' actions and views of the West align more with Russia's views of the world rather than Western views of the world, which is key to Russia's influence strategy in the region. So there's three main ways in which Russia has been influencing audiences, which goes hand in hand with a lot of what my colleague Val just said about Russia's influence in Africa, which the first of which is Russia's official diplomatic and military ties in the region. The second is the growing reach of Arabic-speaking Russian state media. And the third is the Arabic-speaking journalists and influencers on social media amplifying pro-Russian narratives. Next slide, please. So when it comes to the military ties, there has been a notable enhancement of diplomatic and military ties between Russia and several governments of the region. This is welcomed by authoritarian leaders in the region, who are seeking alternative to support and reliance on the West, especially military support. And Russia has been happy and keen to provide those alternatives to gain allies in the region. Those increased ties between Moscow and the region capitals has already opened the doors and continue to open the door further for more opportunities of collaborations in several aspects. And that include the collaboration between Russian state media and media in the region, which we'll touch on in a second. But also through Russian diplomatic missions in the region and their state media, they're able to amplify further pro-Kremlin narratives about the war in Ukraine and many other topics, and spread narratives further to Arabic speakers as a result. Next slide, please. Russian one of the top 3 most watched news broadcasters in the region, right after Al Arabiya and Al Jazeera, and those channels produce, frame and disseminate content that appeals to Arabic-speaking audiences and reminds them of the West's history, West's complicated history in the region. But also some of the content is meant to just appeal to audiences' emotions and feelings, such as this example right here of Putin holding a copy of the Quran and criticizing Western countries for incidents such as the Quran burning. Next slide, please. Russian media also does not just disseminate its content in Arabic, but it also establishes regularly new cooperation agreements with regional, domestic and regional media that allows it to expand its influence operations through these media outlets. And as we're seeing in this example, those media outlets not only disseminate the content, but they post it verbatim on their website. The reach of some of those local media channels does not only allow for the content to go wider, but it also is going to audiences in the region that might not be aware that this content is produced by Russia and even state media in Russia. Next slide, please. The other influencers as part of Russia's strategy in the region are Arabic-speaking journalists who openly identify on their social media accounts, especially X, as affiliated with Russian media. And there's also Arabic-speaking online influencers that we have traced that show signs of coordinated posting and engagement have been key to amplifying Russian propaganda and disinformation to larger following. And those accounts also produce content that's tailored to the regional audience and encourage feelings of resentment towards Western country and carry a lot of disinformation about the war in Ukraine. And some of the content spread from these accounts encourages audiences to see the West's double standards when it comes to conflicts, and again reminds them of the region's complicated history with the West and the US in particular, especially compared to the West's stance on the war in Ukraine. And with that in mind, I think my 5 minutes is up, and I will hand it over to Dia.
Thank you, Dina. Hi, everyone. We noticed similar patterns in Latin America. So the Russian state-owned media outlets, especially Russia Today and Sputnik, continue to be the core of the Kremlin communication in the region. And their websites and social media accounts reach millions of readers in both Portuguese and Spanish language. And the news contents are republished by local newspaper. As a consequence, it gives Russia the opportunity to amplify its narratives about the invasion of Ukraine. But in addition to that, we have observed that Russia is implementing a strategy of customization of narratives to better suit the domestic landscape of each Latin American country. Ambassadors play a central role in this strategy, as they are frequently interviewed by local media outlets, and they can shape the narratives according to the audience in this case. Next slide, please, Roma. Regarding the content published by Russian Today and Sputnik, we noticed the narratives around Ukraine has changed since 2022 from the Russian military operation and the denazification of Ukraine to narratives around sanctions and military aid to Ukraine. But it's important to highlight the frequency of these publications. We noticed that news articles mention Ukraine are now being published more consistently, systematically, and organized. In the first year of the war, those publications were more sporadic, following and responding to key news events, as you can see in the graph on the top of the page. But last year, we observed a daily range of between 20 to 50 articles published in a more consistent way, as you can see at the graph at the bottom of the page. And next slide, please. Russian ambassadors often engaged with Latin American media outlets, especially last year. In Brazil, for instance, we found 176 articles from January to October quoting the Russian ambassador. And the war in Ukraine was the main topic discussed in Brazil. But the Russian ambassadors in Latin America in general discussed a broad range of topics, from the war in Ukraine to narratives surrounding the BRICS and the rise of a multipolar world, depending on the interests of the target country. Next slide, please. And finally, we also saw a trend of politicians, media outlets, and journalists hosting Russian influencers and former Sputnik or Russian Today's journalists for interviews and videos. These collaborations occurred between Russian influencers and left-wing leaders who share similar ideas and narratives against the US in Latin America, like the US imperialism and US colonialism, and it of course favors the Russians' interest in the region. For instance, you can see on the next slide, if you No, is in this one. Sorry, Roman, is this one. The graph on the right side, you can see an example of the Russian journalist Inna Afihenova, who is a former deputy director of Russia Today in the Spanish language, interviewing the Mexican president Andrés Manuel López Obrador just last week. So it's very recent episode. And I think I'm done. Thank you, Roman.
Excellent. So is this the end of the presentations? Andy, would you like to say something, or should I introduce myself and start the moderated discussion?
Please do, Olga.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for everyone for telling us more about the report. My name is Olga Tokariuk. I'm an Open Society University Network Academy Fellow at Chatham House, and I'll be moderating the rest of our discussion today. So it's a great honor, of course, to hear your presentations and to read the report. It's very interesting. I read the previous year's one, and this year's one is very interesting to compare the two. We'll talk about that in more detail in the next hour. Thank you so much for sharing your insights. I encourage all our viewers to ask questions to the presenters. You can use that by typing in your browser askac.org. I already see some questions coming in. I'll ask them in addition to my own questions during the next hour. So feel free. I'll navigate between my own questions and your questions. Feel free to send your questions in askac.org. So first of all, before asking my questions to every presenter today, I want to ask you, Andy, about why did you decide in this report to focus on these geographical areas, not others? So I noticed, for example, that there is a lot of emphasis on countries that are not a part of the so-called Western world. Was it a deliberate decision to look at how Russia targets specifically countries which are not in the West, or were there other motives behind that?
Well, I think there are a combination of factors. For one thing, the world's a big place, and Russia doesn't use the same tactics everywhere. Even within a given region, you will see nuanced differences from country to country, let alone from continent to continent. And so we thought it was important to take as broad a look as possible as to the various methods Russia uses to influence global opinion on Ukraine. Also, I think a lot of attention over the last couple of years has focused almost solely on how Russian messaging resonates or doesn't resonate in the West. And so while it was important for us to clearly to discuss many aspects of that, especially given the amount of sophisticated operational work they do in Europe, for example, Europe isn't the only game in town. There are many opportunities throughout the globe for Russia to exploit long-standing grievances against the West. And in some cases, that means the global South, whether it's Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, and the Middle East. Everywhere people are looking at the conflict through different lenses, historical lenses, cultural lenses, and the like. And so we thought it was important for us to capture as wide a view as possible, while also taking advantage of the fact that the DFRLab has staff from, I think, approximately 16 or 17 countries at this point. And so because we have such a large global footprint, in many ways, it would have been, I think, a missed opportunity to not look at the differences in strategies in different parts of the world where we're already able to keep such a close eye on things. And so while there's no way I can pretend that this report is 100% global in scope, covering 200 plus countries, our team could be 10 times larger, and we still wouldn't have been able to do that effectively. But given the nature of our work, the nature of our international spread, plus the importance of understanding the differences in Russia's approaches, looking at these regions covering 15, 16 different countries seemed like a natural approach for us to take.
Yes, absolutely. And I think there are similar patterns in many of the regions that we've heard about today. But first, before talking about those patterns in countries outside of Ukraine, I would like to talk to Roman and ask you, Roman, a question about Ukraine. So you mentioned about this TikTok campaign, a coordinated effort on TikTok to discredit Ukrainian military leadership and the former defense minister, Alexei Reznikov. And there is a question from a member of our audience who is asking, do you think that actually that contributed to Zelensky's firing the defense minister last autumn? Do you think that disinformation campaign, that attempt to discredit him, led to this decision in a way?
I mean, that's the question that would be better addressed maybe to the President Zelensky, who took this decision, right? Because I cannot speak for him directly. What I can tell you is that this campaign was so widespread that it actually was not only being viewed millions of times in Ukraine, but also in neighboring countries as well. Literally millions of people have seen this video on TikTok, but then it spread to other platforms, and like X, it was translated into multiple languages, and many people seen it. So most likely it damaged the image of the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, minister himself, and most likely Ukraine. But again, I cannot comment on the specific decisions because I was not the one who took them.
Yeah, sure. Well, this is about, the impact that disinformation can have in real life. It's never possible to concretely measure it, but it definitely has an impact. It's just the extent of it that it's very difficult to measure. And with that, I would like to turn to you, Sopo, and ask you more about, Russian disinformation efforts in Georgia. So in this report and also in the previous year report, you write that a big number of Russian citizens, they flocked to Georgia as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and they were perceived in a way as a potential threat to Georgia's national security. So do you observe, in the span of the past year, because there were these fears expressed last year, so over this year, were there any instances when Russian citizens who are in Georgia were engaged in Russian disinformation campaigns, in Russian influence campaigns? So have these fears materialized?
Thank you, Olga, for this question. From our perspective, when we monitor online, we have not seen disinformation spread in an online domain from the Russian citizens who reside in Georgia. However, we saw that these Russian citizens founded many companies, and there are multiple reports about the concerns that these companies might be aiding Russia by passing sanctions. And of course, there are vulnerabilities and emotions in Georgian citizens, and they fear that this might be another leverage for Russia in terms of, for example, defending Russian citizens in Georgia, and this might be another reason for Russia to invade Georgia. Every generation in Georgia witnessed war with Russia, and this is what Russian propaganda and Georgian government's propaganda amplifies, and these are the fears what they play around. So, like, these fears are still there. The risks of national security around the Russian citizens coming to Georgia still there, still persist. And we do not know when there is another mobilization, for example, in Russia, and when we might have another wave of Russian influx in Georgia. So the risks persist, and it's a serious issue for our national security.
I think you already partially answered this, but there is a question also from a member of the audience about this warmongering claims by the Georgian Prime Minister, whether they are working, and do most Georgians believe that another Russian invasion would happen if they sided directly with Ukraine?
Interestingly, we have public opinion polls measuring that narrative. One came in 2023 from USAID Information Integrity Program, and the survey directly asked citizens whether West wants to drag Georgia into war. And more than 30% said that they agreed to the statements. And there was even more results for the statement that Ukraine wanted to drag Georgia into war. So this is like in combination together, like West, EU, US, and Ukraine. And actually, it might seem very surprising that this narrative might resonate Georgian societies, but actually it does resonate because like 30% and 40% is quite huge number for this narrative to proliferate Georgian audiences.
Thank you. And now I would like to turn to Valentin. So can you, first of all, just tell us the names of the countries that you focused on? Because you mentioned West Africa and Sahel. Would be interesting to understand which countries specifically you researched. And also, a question about something that you mentioned, that Russian narrative, that somehow Russia is an alternative to imperialist powers that did so much damage to African countries, is very much, perceived as something that really resonates with the local audiences in Africa. Why do you think it is so? And do political connections with Russia have a role in this?
Thank you for your question, Olga. So yeah, to answer broadly, I focus mostly on Western Africa, on Mali, Burkina Faso, also Niger this year. We also covered South Africa, of course. My colleagues also covered Sudan, but for the report, we mostly focused on the French-speaking African countries. So as I said, Mali, Burkina Faso, and a few others, Cameroon as well, which has several blogs that also amplify Russian narratives. These are countries with we've seen that the French have completely left out the area because of security operations that have backfired on them, and that Russia has sort of come in to fill in a void, which is probably why this vector was so much more present in these countries, and why, for example, Pan-Africanist movements take root there and have relationships with Russia. Drawing again to your second questions on the imperialism, I think it is very interesting to approach it from that side because Russia has traditionally approached, and when I say Russia, I mean the Soviet Union has also approached Africa as an anti-colonial force, and as such, it is not perceived as an imperialistic power, much in the way that it is conducting its war against Ukraine, which is, I guess, presenting a version of fact that is completely biased. There's also a history of South Africa, for instance, having relationships with the Kremlin. We have also a perception that Russia has helped with decolonization in the area, and that is sort of helping African countries not align in this war. Russia is sort of presenting the war in Ukraine as a war between the West and Russia, and presenting itself in Africa as the alternative, is saying that we don't really have to choose between Russia and the West. You can also have your way, which is making business with Russia, which is having ties with Russia, but that is also helping Russia conduct this war.
This is very interesting, and also what you mentioned about an increasing cooperation between the local media outlets and Russian state-controlled outlets, and the amplification of narratives that originate in Russian state-controlled media by African outlets. And I think, Dina, you also spoke about that. So I would now like to turn to you to elaborate on that a little bit more, and also, to address the question of what are the risks and implications of Russia's growing influence on the MENA region through social and traditional media, as well as strengthened diplomatic and military ties.
Yeah, thank you. It relates a lot to what Val went through because there's similar strategy for influence, but the main risks here are similar to what would be everywhere else in the world, which is the Russia's influence, especially in media, with disinformation and propaganda. It distorts people's views of any given topic and places it in the light that Russia wants the audiences to see it in. And this, for example, in the content that we've seen going to Arabic speakers, and also to other audiences around the world, we've seen over and over the narrative that Ukraine is the aggressor in this war, and that Russia's fighting a special military operation, and it's fighting Nazis in Ukraine. Those are narratives that we're seeing come up a lot in Arabic as well. And obviously, the Russia strategy is to keep repeating those repeating those narratives enough and in enough languages in order for people to believe them. But unfortunately, there's not enough people buying those lies. But the main implications with diplomatic and the military ties in this region is that it allows for further opportunities of collaborations between the government and the media that allows that also has a stamp of approval of the leaders of some of those MENA countries, which allows for that Russian influence to get a pretty good level of access through official channels, official government channels, or through media channels. Also, Russia's increased diplomatic and military ties in the region are by design intended to reduce reliance on the West and to owe Russia more favors than the West in some cases. And that will inevitably have major implications on the short and the long terms about Russia's ability to continue to influence audiences in the region about the direction of the war in Ukraine and any given topic. Two main examples come to mind for how Russia is already investing very heavily in continuing to be in the region is that Russia is currently building a nuclear plant in Egypt. It costs $30 billion. It's a pretty big project that will allow Russia to continue engaging very meaningfully with the Egyptian government in many, many various ways and continue to invest heavily in it. And will allow to have a lot of influence in there as a result. In Libya, Russia is, that's that other example, Russia is strengthening its presence there even further through the Wagner Group. There are many, many examples through the region that are not just diplomatic and military ties. They're simply they're ways to open further doors for Russia to continue to have further influence in the region. Thank you.
Thank you. And Beatrice, I found really interesting, you mentioned this very active Russian ambassadors in the Latin America that are going on, publishing on traditional media, very active on social media, that they give interviews. That's really remarkable, also because it means that the local media give them a platform, that they still see them as a legitimate source of information. So my question is about that, are RT, Sputnik, and also Russian officials frequently and widely seen as legitimate sources of information in Latin America? Why do you think it is so? And also how, Russian actors manipulate and exploit the local political context?
Thank you for the question. So starting with the role of the ambassadors, they are perceived, they are considered a primary source because they represent a state. So their position is new worth for the media landscape in Latin America. But in contrast, Sputnik and Russia Today, they don't have the same position as the ambassador. The journalists and the media in Latin America, they know that they are state-owned media outlets, so they are more careful in republish and reposting content from them. The content published by Sputnik and Russian Today, they usually to be republished by medias that have ties with the left-wing parties, or they have this editorial position. So yes, the ambassadors, they are indeed perceived and they are used and interviewed as a primary source, but on the other hand, the Russian media outlets, they are not very useful for the media landscape because the journalists know that there are some interests behind the content that they produce. And Latin American is a very cultural and diverse region. And in some groups and some locations, Russia can find more opportunities to explore these narratives. This is why the ambassadors are being used to shape the narratives in Latin America, especially.
Thanks so much, Beatrice. So a couple of questions from me, and then I'll switch to questions from the audience. And thank you, the audience, for being so active. We are receiving a lot of questions. We'll try to address most of them, probably not all. But first of all, my question to all of you, whoever wants to answer, multiple people can answer it. What is the evolution of Russian narratives in 2023 compared to 2022? So are the narratives still the same, or have they changed? So in particular, like what I noticed, for example, I wonder whether you agree that I have an impression that Russia focuses less now on denial of its war crimes than it did in 2022 when it tried to question, the Bucha massacre and tried to blame Ukraine for Bucha massacre or deny that it ever happened. So I observed that these efforts are not there or are not as active recently, that Russia refocused on other narratives and, directs its resources into other things. So do you agree? And what's the evolution of narratives that you witness? Roman, maybe you'd like to go first.
Sure. Yeah, I agree on that they became less insistent on denying the war crimes that they are committing, but they doubled down on discrediting Ukraine. So I think this is a part of like the overall understanding that they want to win war. So in order to do that, they need to force Ukraine to stop resisting by increasing internal squabbles, fights, exploit any vulnerabilities and wedge divides between people who are in Ukraine, who are fled because they become refugees because they fled the war, between political leadership and military leadership. So this is on the one hand. On the second hand, they also double down on discrediting Ukraine in the face of foreign partners, so that they want to present Ukraine as a bad and unreliable partner and actually stop the aid to Ukraine. So in that case, Ukraine will be not having enough resources to withstand Russia, and in ultimately Russia will win. So I think that they reevaluated their approach. And another thing that I also spotted is that they started better understanding the target audiences. They started analyzing them and crafting the messages for them. So it's not like blatant messages that, like, I don't know. So for Ukraine, there are almost no messages that were like brotherly nations anymore, right? But there are rather specific messages on some problems and that there is no future. So really negativistic view of Ukraine future, it's being disseminated and any problem being amplified. The same goes with other countries as well. But I'll let my colleague to comment as well.
Yes, would anyone else like to comment on that?
Yeah. I'll add one note. What we saw in 2023 was Russia's position, like, you see what happens if you support Ukraine or follow Ukraine's path, because it was increasingly, Russia was increasingly spreading this tactics about like the scare tactics of like the war, fear and everything. So if in the first year of war, in South Caucasus, in Georgia, for example, we saw some denial or the narratives from local pro-Kremlin actors that, no, Russia is winning, Russia is strong, Russia is militarily, I don't know, stronger even than West. Now this year in 2023, we saw that this is what will happen. You will follow the same thing. Your children will be affected, and like the social hardships we said that social hardships will follow, and this is what is happening. This is not a new narrative itself, but we see that this is more amplified, and we also saw the change in tactics in terms of covering almost all social media platforms and chat applications. At some point, some of the cases of disinfo, where we already know and have been monitoring, became more sophisticated. So we can say that the narratives are not new, but they are more tailored, and some of the narratives are more aggressive.
Thank you. There was a question from the audience whether this presentation will be recorded and available later. I can confirm that it will be available to watch on Atlantic Council YouTube channel and also on ac.tv. So if you missed a part of it, or if you would like to share it with your colleagues and friends, please feel free to do that, going to the Atlantic Council YouTube channel and on ac.tv. My next question is about the role of the media, and the fact that Ukraine is not in the media on the front pages and is not on the and is not the first item on TV news bulletins anymore as it was in 2022. So do you think this disappearance of Ukraine from the media, or less prominence of the topic of Russia's war in Ukraine in the media, and Ukraine fatigue, as someone calls it, has it contributed to, giving more prominence to Russian disinformation actors? So if the journalists are not on the ground in Ukraine, if they are not reporting, if Ukraine is not in the media anymore, does it help those who do propaganda and disinformation to, and they do not stop doing that, does it help them? Would like to take that question. I don't know, maybe Dina.
Well, in terms of Ukraine not being in the news, I would venture to say that that has not been the case, at least from the region that I'm following, because even though there is a big conflict going on right now in the MENA region, Ukraine has still been in the news, and in fact, Russian media has brought it out in the news a lot, especially in comparison to the war, the Israel-Hamas conflict at the moment. Part of what happened after October, which was not throughout 2023, which is not in this report, was how Russian media started comparing the Israel-Hamas war to the Ukraine war and the West's reaction to it. So as a result of this, the Ukraine war has not really disappeared from the news in the Middle East. I can't really speak to other region, but that has been it has been part of Russia's strategies to spread certain narratives about the war, but that only started towards the end of the year, and that's something that we are going to likely monitor in the new year.
Great, thanks, Dina. And let's take some questions from the audience. And the first one is about the greater dependence of Putin on China. Have any of the experts seen any new trends in information operations that reflect this new interrelationship?
I can briefly say that we saw some media cooperations between Russia and China, and they very much relied on themselves, how their image would be framed. But this has not been our major focus for 2023, and definitely we will follow the China issue as an emerging threat in 2024. That will be our focus, but it was not the major focus for this report.
Okay, thanks, Sopo. And another interesting question. So have any of the experts seen any information operations by Russia that have failed because Russia have not understood the local culture or politics? So we are speaking about, Russia tailoring its messaging, its tactics to different audiences, but were there also notable failures when Russia didn't understand those contexts and, didn't manage to persuade the audiences it was targeting?
I could start. Or Wally, if you want to go first.
Oh, sure. There's not in terms of the failure of the tailoring of narratives in a cultural aspect, but I guess that in some cases, especially the ones that I've covered in France, we're seeing that the societies are becoming a bit more resilient to disinformation coming from Russia, and that narratives that seem a bit off, that seem completely over the top, are picked up on by authorities and by people alike who see that things are not right or not correct. There was this incident with at the beginning of the war between Israel and Palestine, where David stars were spray painted on walls in Paris, and that was almost from day one identified as a disinformation operation from Russia because it was amplified only on Russian news channels. That is, I think, echoing the fact that people see that when stories seem to be fabricated and do not relate to what is happening to the current media space in their countries, they're becoming a bit more resilient, and they tend to call out mis and disinformation coming from Russia more easily. But that is because also of the resilience of societies being exposed to so many narratives since the beginning of the war.
Thanks, Val. Roman, would you like to add something?
Yeah, absolutely. So in Ukraine, there was a case of campaign, let me recall this, lights on, Zelensky off, if I remember correctly. So there was a hashtag launched on Twitter and some other social media. When Russia started attacking Ukrainian energy infrastructure and there were blackouts, they basically, I don't know, nudged people to go on the streets to oust President Zelensky in order to get back the electricity to their homes. It actually sounds like really weird logic because people actually blamed Russia in those shortages in electricity. So this message did not work. And actually Ukrainian social media users mocked this heavily. They started laughing at it because some of those messages, they featured really bad translations from Russian into Ukrainian, and Ukrainian users picked them up, and they are still kind of used meme, and people still referring to some phrases from this campaign even till today. So sometimes these campaigns, they're absolutely off, but again, sometimes they might hit and strike pretty hard as well.
Thank you, Roman. So I remind again people who are watching that you can ask your question by using a website. Just type in your browser askac.org and send your question there. I'll try to ask your question. And in the meantime, something that I would like to discuss with also all of you, but maybe we'll start with Beatriz, because you mentioned about the big role of RT and Sputnik in Latin America. I was wondering, about this balance between the traditional media that Russians are still using in those countries that did not impose sanctions on RT and Sputnik, such as Latin American countries. Also, you, Val, and you, Dina, mentioned that Russia relies heavily on its own state-controlled media versions in local languages in Middle East and in North Africa and in Africa as well. But my question is about this balance between the use of Russian state-controlled outlets in non-Western countries and also use of social media. So how do they combine the use of two? Is there a prevalence of one type of media over the other? And tell us a little bit more about the social media also. What platforms are Russians using in each respective region? I'll start with you, Beatriz.
In Latin America, they combine the websites with social media accounts, and the social media accounts have a good representativity in this strategy. They reach millions of people in Portuguese and Spanish, and they use, for instance, Twitter, TikTok. They are producing a lot of videos, especially in Portuguese. And they also use the Telegram to send direct message to specific groups. So they articulate the communication using all these channels. And the content released in these channels are similar because, but depending on the country, we need to frame the country to analyze specifically the narratives. But if you consider only one country, for instance, Argentina or Brazil, we are going to see the same patterns of communication and narratives navigating through all these channels. So these channels are complementary in this strategy, and they are very active and productive in terms of result of influences and the perspective, promoting the Russian perspective of the world in Latin America.
Thanks. And Dina, would you like to tell us more about what's happening in Middle East and North Africa?
Yeah, absolutely. In the Middle East and North Africa region, it's also a combo mix of different platforms, but really Russia state media's main success in Arabic-speaking countries is through the TV channel, because it's watched by large audiences in the region, and it's one of the top 3 most watched broadcasters. So that's really one of the most successful platform. But it is Russian state media is also very active on X, and some of the journalists affiliated with Russian state media are also very active through their own accounts on X and on Telegram, spreading their content even further. But it's not really one platform that is one social media platform that's more successful than the other. They all kind of complete each other, with the main one being the TV channels.
That's very interesting. And there is a follow-up question from Tatiana Voroshko from the Voice of America, who asks, what role does X, Twitter, play in disseminating Russian messages compared to other social media in your region?
It does play a big role. It is one of the most active platforms, and Russia Today Arabic has several accounts there, whether for breaking news or there's different accounts, and they're all in Arabic, reflecting that is not just strategy of having one account to distribute content in Arabic, is to have as many accounts representing Russian state media, whether through the channels themselves and even Sputnik Arabic, not just Russia Today. There's also the journalists that are working there that having their own accounts in X, so they're very successful through that platform.
Yeah, very interesting, Dina. Thank you. Valentin, would you like to tell us a little bit more whether it's similar in West Africa and Sahel?
Sure. Well, regarding your previous question on the presence of the balance of media and state media and other types of content, I think that right now the situation is quite different from country to country. But in West Africa, we can say that there's a low presence of Russian state media per se. What they do is they mostly rely on blogs that would repost content and source their content from Sputnik Afrique, from RT, or from other news outlets that have already sourced their articles from Sputnik or RT. What we can see, though, is that they are reusing operatives that used to work for RT in French. So France issued a ban against RT a couple years ago from now. And what we've seen is that operatives and TV show hosts such as Xavier Moreau are going on the air on Afrique Media TV, the Pan-Africanist news channel, which just signed a partnership with RT to comment on the war, to comment on issues of the West, and to comment on geopolitical issues all the time. And that shows that there is a great versatility in partnerships and in Russia going forward and making its operatives known in local media without having access to official channels. What we see also is the rise of websites that tend to spread Pan-Africanist news and Russian narratives that are not very well done, if you ask my opinion about that. So we've seen, for example, websites that are presenting themselves as web televisions that operates allegedly in Chad or in the Central African Republic that tend to repost this kind of content, but it's very essentially making copy-paste articles from other Pan-Africanist news outlets. Regarding social media per se, I would say that X is less prevalent for African media in general, especially if we talk about Russian disinformation. I would say that Facebook is a lot more prevalent in that sense. In fact, groups on Facebook are usually the ones where we will see narratives that can spread and where a lot of people will actually be exposed to Russian mis and disinformation. And that's also due to the fact that Telegram is not widely in use, but we see that in case of channels being deplatformed, they actually switch to Telegram, which is a tactic that is widespread and that is not just typical for the region that I worked on. But it is more prevalent on Facebook than anywhere else.
Thank you. Sopo, what's the situation in the Caucasus countries, and are there any differences between the three countries in terms of, the platforms Russians are using to peddle disinformation about Ukraine?
So in Georgia, the major source of information still remains TV, and as we see the proliferation of the narratives in the regions, still they're like there's primary source TV, and then plus informal sources through neighbors, friends, classmates, etc. Twitter is not that popular. Facebook remains the major social media platform in Georgia, and we see many operations conducted on Twitter from pro-Kremlin sources as well as government sources. After multiple takedowns from Meta of pro-Kremlin actors in Georgia, we see the migration of these accounts and networks to other platforms. So we can say that like Facebook, emerging is TikTok, and also Telegram plays significant role in shaping information space in social media. But still, TV remains, as I said, the major source of information. And as I already discussed, government and government-affiliated media outlets also very frequently spread disinformation or narratives that are aligned with Kremlin agenda. So like the TV channels that have many resources, funding and financial and human resources as well, are sometimes engaged in spreading these narratives too.
Thanks. Roman, we know that the situation in Ukraine is really different in terms of that the access to Russian state-controlled media has been restricted. Basically, they were banned in Ukraine years ago, even before the Russian full-scale invasion. So Russia has been for a long time relying mostly on social media in Ukraine. Can you tell us more about the role of Telegram in particular? There is a debate now in Ukraine about banning Telegram. Do you see it happening? And another question is about the Operation Doppelganger, one of the Russian tactics that you discuss in the report, how Russians on social media, especially on Facebook, they tried to, they posted the screenshots and links that led to the spoofing websites, not real websites that were posing as legitimate media outlets. So tell us more about this tactics, because it wasn't only observed in Ukraine.
Yeah, thank you very much. Quite extensive two questions, but I'll try to not to start the lecture. So first of all, about the role of Telegram, yes. First of all, there was a trend of diminishing interest in legacy media in Ukraine for a few years, and people started getting their news from social media. It was a trend even before a full-scale invasion in 2022, according to Internews U-Media report that is being published annually and sponsored by the USAID. But since the full-scale invasion in 2022, popularity of Telegram as the major source of news skyrocketed. It's a predominant platform where Ukrainians are taking their news from. And indeed, there is a lot of question about whether Telegram is connected somehow with Russian state and or cooperates with it, so that there might be there are some discussions in Ukraine whether it should be somehow limited or restricted, because a lot of the disinformation actually comes from Telegram, but partially because, again, because of its popularity, right? So the disinformation happens when people get their news from, so that's why it happens. And quickly going to the previous question that you asked my colleagues, is that in multiple countries, like about the X and how it amplifies content, for many people who are not using, in multiple countries, who are not using Telegram as predominant network, a lot of the messages from Telegram be translated and disseminated on X, and a lot of them are disinformation messages. So that what happens. And now getting back to the doppelganger, indeed, it's not only the issue of Ukraine; it's multi-state campaign. At least, I know, multiple countries in Europe, so I know, France, Germany, and multiple others were targeted by this. So basically what happens, usually it's the ad on Meta platforms, so on Facebook. In Ukraine, it looked like a caricature, I don't know, ridiculing either Ukrainian leaders or situation in Ukraine with really negative text, and a link that link to the website that is, I don't know, some abstract name, usually it's some stolen domain. And when you click on it from Ukrainian IP address, which is extremely important, because if you are clicking it outside of Ukraine or we are using the VPN in another location, you will see nothing. But if you click from the Ukrainian location, it will get you to the copy of, let's say, Union website or RBK or Ukrainian Pravda, which have exactly the same style. They are like copied style of original media, but they will, the domain extension would be different. So like not Pravda UA, but Pravda something else, like IO or something else. And there will be extremely like negative, I don't know, article. Sometimes it was not perfect translation into Ukrainian. And yeah, it will be spreading some negative news, presenting it supposedly as Ukrainian news outlet. The same campaign spotted in multiple countries, and like small announcement, I guess we will be publishing an article about that in multiple countries soon, but this is just, yeah, brief announcement on
Right, really
work of our
looking
team.
forward to that. Thank you, Roman. So we have about 14 minutes left, and we'll be soon be wrapping up. And I'll ask you all for your, final remarks and some constructive ways of how to counter what we just discussed. But before that, there is a question about the use of Russia's use of deepfakes. So I'll read it. It's from a member of audience. Kremlin strategy appears to be volume, volume, volume. Why not take a more sophisticated approach? You'd think they'd be good at deepfakes, for example. And I'll add to that my own question about the use of AI. So not just deepfakes, but AI. We've seen that in the TikTok campaign to discredit Ukraine's ex-defense minister, an AI-generated narration was used. Have you observed Russia using more of these tools? Have Russian deepfakes became more efficient, and what to expect in this regard? Who'd like to take this question?
I could start.
Please. Yes.
Yeah, so let's start from the quality of deepfakes. So this year we've seen at least 3 deepfakes of General Zaluzhny, ex-commander-in-chief of armed forces of Ukraine. There were 3 of them. They were not perfect. They were evidently like AI generated, AI assisted, right? But they were definitely better than the deepfake of Zelensky in March 2022. I'm not gonna lie, it was better, but it was obvious. So there are some improvement, and maybe there will be some even more improvement into the future, like in the next year or next few years. But as of now, it's not perfect, and there are ways to spot that there is some kind of actually AI involved into this. So one of the reasons why they are doing like engaging in volume rather than like quality, as you would say, right, is that if this kind of campaign being uncovered and they invested a lot of resources into it, it will go into the waste. But with the same resources, they could, I don't know, launch thousands of AI narrated videos on TikTok or something else that would be less sophisticated, but at least something might stick and might be actually being amplified by real users and real people who would actually see this, trust it, will not verify it, and spread it further. So that's the main bet, right? It's not about being extremely smart. It's just like trying to launch whatever you have and waiting for something to stick and to work out. It's been discussed in the Russian propaganda fire hose, if I'm not mistaken. It's an approach, and it's not changed since.
So it's still about volume, and new techniques are just adding to the volume. It's not about quality yet. Okay, so let's go into the last 10 minutes, and I'll ask each one of you to answer these 2 questions from the members of audience, and I think it would be good to wrap it up with that. So the first question is, what successful communication strategies have you seen to combat Russia's disinformation narratives? And the second question is, what can Ukraine's allies and supporters do better in countering Russia's information operations? So please, let's start with Beatrice and go in reverse order.
I would divide my answer in two parts. So first, the best kind of narrative, we are seeing the humor. It's a good choice when you need to counter disinformation. So you affect directly the credibility of who posted that information. So using humor could be a good solution to counter some narratives in specific situations. And in terms of...
I'll shamelessly use the opportunity to advertise my own research paper on the use of humor by Ukraine to counter Russia's disinformation. Please go
this
ahead,
is great.
Sorry.
No, thank you for this information. And in terms of countering disinformation in general, I think monitoring as much as possible and responding to any kind of disinformation campaign as soon as possible. I think it's the best and the faster approach to minimize the effects of a disinformation campaign. But I'm sure that my colleagues have others insights and contributions to this question.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Beatrice. Dina, do you have in mind any specific cases of successful countering of Russian disinformation campaigns?
Yeah, in the Middle East and North Africa region, because there's press freedom is going through such a difficult time right now. I think that the main thing that I think can answer this question is the mere existence of independent media and fact-checking and verification efforts in the region is key, because independent media and fact-checking verification groups are under a lot of crackdowns in the Middle East and North Africa region. Their existence would be able, their mere existence helps the ongoing debunking of Russian propaganda in the region. And I don't really think that there's a lot of other there's a lot of other sources at the moment in this region to combat that type of influence.
Thank you. Valentin?
Yeah, for Africa, I would say that there is also a conundrum of trying to increase media literacy and trying to increase monitoring and fact checking. So ensuring that the information that you're displayed with is actual information that is fact checked, that is double checked, that comes from newsworthy news outlets and not some obscure Facebook group. There is also a need to increase the work of journalists too on that area. And I think that some countries have had some successes actually countering disinformation, not specifically in Africa, because we're not the targets of disinformation related to Ukraine per se. But for example, France has been very good at picking up on areas that are targeting its domestic audience. One of such examples, for example, the missile strike against the hotel in Kharkiv in November 2023, which was pictured in Russian media as well, French mercenaries killed in a hotel, and what was already debunked by fact checkers and by state organs, by the French MFA and other organizations right away. So having this kind of, I would say, proactive attitude toward Russian disinformation is what I see in my experience as most successful in conjunction with media literacy and fact checking.
That's great, thank you. Sopo?
I would add proactive campaigns as one of the means to counter disinformation, because like we mentioned, media literacy fact checking, sometimes it's like follow-up step to disinformation. And as we do our homework as researchers, like what are the emerging narratives, what are the dates to watch, what might be, I don't know, Kremlin narrative around certain elections, whatever, like official campaigns could work similarly. For example, states involved countering Russian disinfo and admitting that Russian disinformation is a threat to national security, they could also press spend some resources and time to identify those emerging narratives proactively and then plan some information campaigns to, I don't know, like to target citizens so they are not vulnerable to disinformation. And the second point, I would say it should be like whole of society approach. It's really hard to counter this whole, I don't know, the whole machine of propaganda, which is state sponsored from only like fact checking perspective or like CSOs countering with this serious issue. States, different institutions, educational institutions, everyone should work together to counter this. But unfortunately and sadly, in the regions we covered, we see that sometimes those actors who have to help us, sometimes they're issue and problem themselves. So that would be my comment.
Thank you. Yeah, so basically you talk about debunking, identifying what Russians are planning to do and talking about that and exposing that before they launch these campaigns, and about the beehive approach. And Roman, I know you wrote about that in Ukraine's case, how Ukraine used this beehive approach to counter disinformation. Can you tell us more a little bit? Because I think Ukraine's experience is really something positive that should be studied.
Yeah, thank you for referring to the report. Indeed, 1 month ago, we presented a report that I co-authored with Jakub Karensky called How Ukraine Fights Russian Disinformation, Beehive versus Mammoth. So basically, we synthesized 10 lessons, which are actually echo with what colleagues already said, right? I will not be actually talking about all 10 of them because you could read the report. I will not be wasting time for that. The only thing that I would say that for the Western countries and like for many countries, in order to fight disinformation, the first step that you should probably do is acknowledge that this is a huge problem. Like the World Economic Forum recognized that disinformation would be the biggest problem in the next 2 years, and in like 5 to 10 years, it would be like in the top 10 for sure, like number 6, if I remember correctly. So the thing is that when you understand that this is serious, because it actually destroys social cohesion, it actually impacts how people make their decisions. It is a big problem that should be actually treated in a way. So this is a huge first step. But then, yeah, you need to bring numbers for people that are looking into this. And here is a cooperation between civil society and the government is important. It's not that it's like a top-down approach, but rather like a partnership, simply because no single actor could fight this issue alone, because it is so much of things happening all the time and in different places that you need multitude of actors, local, national, on different levels, that would be able to spot different trends and being able to coordinate and fight it efficiently. But yeah, I'll stop on that, not to take a lot of other time, but there are 10 lessons, and if you're interested, please refer to this report. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Roman. Thank you, everyone, for sharing your thoughts on, how to counter Russian disinformation efforts. So today we looked at the findings of the report, which you can find on the Atlantic Council website, Undermining Ukraine, and how Russian disinformation functioned in various regions of the world, and which narratives about Ukraine it pushed and what tactics it used. This is becoming an increasingly important issue, because the issue of Ukraine is being used in many internal political debates in many countries. We see what is happening now in the US, how the aid to Ukraine became a hostage of an internal political debate in the United States, although the outcome of war in Ukraine will not only define what happens to Ukraine as a country, but what happens to peace in Europe, what happens to the global order, and so on. So we can expect more of Russian efforts to interfere and influence public opinion, more Russian disinformation campaigns this year, as elections will be happening in many countries across the world, including the US, including the European Union, with the European Parliament elections in the next months. In Georgia, there will be elections this year, and in about 80 countries across the world. So we'd better be prepared. And I agree with you, Roman, that the first step is to recognize the importance of the issue, that Russian disinformation is a threat. Very often it is a threat to national security. This is definitely the case of Ukraine. This is the case of Moldova, which increasingly recognizes that. So learn from, this country's experience and just recognize that this issue is important. I want to thank you so much for participating in today's event. I want to thank our audience. And I'm Olga Tokaryuk, a moderator of today's discussion. I will just pass the floor back to Andy to conclude today's session.
Thanks, everyone, and thank you, Olga, for moderating today's conversation. As Olga mentioned earlier, we are archiving a copy of today's talk. You can find it on the Atlantic Council's YouTube channel. You can also find it later at ac.tv if you're not a member of ac.tv yet. And finally, the report itself, please come read it. It will be worth your time. What you've heard today is just a small fraction of everything that was covered, given that approximately 15 researchers were involved in producing the report. So please visit us at atlanticcouncil.org to read the Undermining Ukraine report. You can also find us at DFRLab on Twitter/X, on Blue Sky, on Facebook, and elsewhere, where you'll see convenient links to it as well. Thanks for joining us today. I hope you all have a good day.